Welcome to Swai Files. I am Swai. On that fateful journey were 27 incredibly adorable boys. But behind that seemingly innocent number lies a horrifying story. A tragedy filled with immense pain and the most brutal snowstorm that mountain had ever witnessed. Not long after the journey began, the snow rose high, swallowing the group up to their waists. The group became trapped, and then amidst the vast and freezing wilderness, death slowly approached. 5 of them never returned. As for the lucky survivors, they came back with stories of death, the harshness of nature, and a haunting memory that would never fade. The snowstorm that year was considered one of the worst anyone there had ever witnessed. In the town of Hofsgrund, a small, peaceful village at the edge of Germany's Black Forest, the residents began to hear eerie screams echoing from the dark mountain. Those sounds seemed to tear apart the quietness of the night, carrying an unmistakable sense of urgency. Then suddenly, there was a knock on the door of a lonely farmhouse on the mountainside. The knock was strong, rapid, and echoed through the stillness of the night. When the door opened, standing before them were 2 British boys, pale-faced, lips trembling, and they could only utter one fragmented, desperate sentence. "The boys are sick on the mountain, need help." Without many words, a group of brave villagers immediately gathered. In the midst of the fierce snowstorm, with temperatures below freezing, they hurried toward the mountain, hoping to save the boys in danger. But when they arrived, the scene before them was horrifying. Scattered across the mountainside, half buried in the snow, were the frozen bodies of the young schoolboys. They had lost their way. But something wasn't right. Why were the boys not dressed warmly enough for such a harsh journey? Where were the adults? And why were they walking on the mountainside during such a catastrophic snowstorm? These questions were only the beginning of a tangled and complex story. Half-truths, lies woven by Nazi propaganda, and a shameful cover-up at the highest levels. That's why you've never heard of this tragedy. The truth about what happened would remain buried in darkness for 80 years. But as they say, lies cannot be hidden forever. They will be revealed, no matter how late. This tragedy was disguised as an unavoidable accident. But the truth is, that too was a lie. And to understand how everything came to this, we need to go back in time to the starting point of the tragedy. Friday morning, April 17th, 1936, at 9 a.m. 27 boys from Strand School in Brixton, London had risen early, eagerly standing outside a youth hostel in Freiburg. Excitement shone on every face, for they were about to embark on a special adventure, a trek through the Black Forest, led by their beloved 27-year-old German teacher, Mr. Arthur Brentwood. The trip was promoted as a simple spring hike along picturesque trails from Freiburg to the town of Tottenberg and back. The original plan was for the journey to last 10 days, an adventure that was not too challenging but full of wonders. However, just before the group was about to set off, an odd detail emerged. Mr. Arthur, seemingly confused, asked 2 hostel staff members about the route to the mountain. Just minutes before the journey began, the teacher appeared to not know where he was going. Upon closer inspection, the hostel staff realized that Arthur did not have a detailed map. The difference between the basic map Arthur held and the accurate map he should have had was significant. Yet despite this oversight, the staff marked the route with a pen, assuming Arthur knew what he was doing. They merely issued a weather warning and advised him to stick to the main paths. But the oddities didn't stop there. The boys in the group were dressed in summer clothes, and it seemed they didn't carry enough water. Nevertheless, no one said anything further, as everyone trusted Arthur. However, Arthur's group was far more unprepared than anyone realized. Not only was he unfamiliar with the route, but Arthur was also unaware of the weather conditions. He didn't check the weather report at the tourist center, nor did he read the notices posted at the hostel. Had he done so, Arthur would have been forewarned about the approaching storm. He would have known that even for a local, hiking 21 kilometers over the Shan Mountains in normal weather would have been a challenge, let alone with the impending storm. Still, the group began their journey with the innocent confidence of young boys, unaware of the danger that awaited them. They laughed and were full of energy, following the teacher they trusted, oblivious that each step was bringing them closer to disaster. Shortly after 9 a.m., once the group had left the hostel, Mr. Arthur Brentwood faced his first decision. A risky choice. At the end of the journey, a note from the travel company had clearly provided safer options to shorten the distance, using the tram to the base of the mountain or taking the cable car. They could even combine both to minimize risks. But Arthur ignored this advice. Instead, he decided to begin the trek with a 3 kilometers walk along the tram line to the final station at the foot of the mountain. The snowstorm hadn't fully hit yet, but the first signs were already evident in the atmosphere. Along the way, the weather shifted from light snow to heavy snow. Snow began falling incessantly, covering the ground. By about 9:45 a.m., the group had a brief encounter with 2 bus company employees from Freiburg who were tirelessly shoveling snow to clear the way for buses. Another warning sign appeared, but it too was ignored. The group continued, unaware that each step was leading them closer to disaster. Perhaps in an attempt to shorten the path, Arthur decided to lead the group north, diverging from the marked route on his map. This was his second decision, and it would be the turning point that led to the tragedy. The group got lost. They circled the area so much that they passed the very hostel they had just left, and then wandered lost on the road back to Freiburg. By around 11:30 a.m., the snow had piled up to 30 centimeters, blanketing the boys. Fritz Trenkel, the owner of the St. Valentine hostel, and his son witnessed the scene and were horrified by the group's severe exposure to the cold. When Arthur arrived at the door of the hostel, he began asking Mrs. Susanna Trenkel, Fritz's wife, for directions to the summit of Scharnsland. The account Susanna later gave to the police was a warning that no one heeded. "You want to go up Scharnsland in this weather? With this snow?" Arthur confidently replied, "Yes," as if everything was still under control. Susanna tried to warn him further, emphasizing that the route he had chosen was the longest and that he would not be able to find his way in this storm. However, Arthur retorted that there were signs marking the way. But Susanna knew that by the time Arthur reached Sollocker, those signs would surely be buried under thick snow. Arthur remained undeterred. He simply said, "I'll clear them off," and walked out, leaving Susanna in deep concern. It wasn't until Arthur walked out of the house that Susanna realized he wasn't alone. He was leading a group of boys. The young children, wearing shorts, were utterly unprepared for such a harsh journey. As the Trenkel family watched the group set off up the mountain, anger and horror welled up. They couldn't believe Arthur was leading those boys into such a brutal storm. No one thought they could make it far, but everyone was wrong. By around 2:30 p.m., the group had gotten lost once more after traveling about 5 kilometers and passing 2 prominent landmarks, Zolaka and Kolahau. The snow was so deep that the group had to kick their way through to create a path. And just as they neared Kolahau, they happened to meet 2 woodcutters who were heading home because the snowstorm had become too severe. The woodcutters warned the group once again, "Don't go on." But Arthur, still clinging to his misguided confidence, didn't listen. The woodcutters eventually gave up trying to convince them and directed the group toward Kabel Valley, a region just before the steep slope leading to the Scharnsland summit. And so the group continued their dangerous journey. Just half an hour later, around 3 p.m., 2 of the youngest boys began complaining about the unbearable cold. Roy Witham, a 14-year-old boy, had started slipping frequently. The storm was worsening by the minute. The snow had piled up nearly 2 feet, and each step felt as if they were wading through a sea of snow. Yet, the boys kept moving forward, placing absolute trust in Arthur's leadership. At around 3:15 p.m., the group finally reached the base of Capel Valley, where they encountered a postman named Otto Sturt. Otto, sensing something was wrong, tried to stop them. He said the weather was too dangerous to continue. "Don't go on," he said. "This storm is no joke." But once again, Arthur dismissed the warning and led the group forward, unaware that they were walking straight into the jaws of death. It was now 8:30 p.m. In the front room of Bernhard Lorenz's farmhouse, Eugene Schweitzer, a 22-year-old young man, sat leisurely enjoying his daily bread. The room was warm and quiet, the flickering firelight illuminating the old wooden walls. They were having a casual conversation, exchanging a few everyday stories, when suddenly, knock, knock, knock. The sound of knocking shattered the calm of the room. Schweitzer and Lorenz looked at each other in confusion, wondering who could be knocking at the door at this hour, in the middle of a raging snowstorm. The knocking wasn't just any sound, but one filled with desperate urgency. When Lorenz opened the door, 2 boys stood before him, their bodies trembling, faces pale, and clothes soaked. The words tumbled from their mouths like frantic shouts, but neither Lorenz nor Schweitzer could understand the unfamiliar language. The church bells of Hofsgrund tolled softly in the dark night sky, signaling the evening prayer. In the dim light of the oil lamp, the 2 boys stood there, their breath hitching, trembling not only from the cold, but from sheer panic. After a few moments of confusion, one of the boys managed to utter a few broken words in shaky German. "Jungens, Krankenberg Ilfa." That was all he could say. But that was enough for Lorenz and Schweitzer to understand. Something terrible was happening on the mountain. The boys are sick on the mountain, need help. Those words echoed, filled with pain and urgency, like a plea that could not be ignored. Lorenz and Schweitzer didn't take long to decide. They immediately took the 2 boys to the local inn for help. But before they could leave, more boys started to emerge from the darkness, trembling and exhausted. And then, at that very moment, amid the howling wind and the raging storm, another sound broke through. The sound of terrifying screams echoing from the distant mountain. The high-pitched, disjointed screams were filled with desperation, as if coming from lost souls battling death. Lorenz and Schweitzer stood frozen in place, a chilling sense of dread washing over them, as if they too were being pulled into the tragedy on the mountain. Immediately, the entire village of Hofsgrund was mobilized. The news spread like wildfire through the cold night, and not a single person in the small village stood still. Brave villagers, disregarding their own safety, banded together to climb the mountain, knowing full well that the terrible snowstorm had engulfed everything. In the biting cold, they began their rescue mission, hoping to find the boys before it was too late. For the next 2 hours, amidst the freezing mountains and the fierce storm, they fought relentlessly against the harsh forces of nature. The strong men of the village used skis, sleds, and even carried the exhausted boys on their backs. Every step was a struggle with fate. Every time they bent down was a fragile hope of finding someone still alive. And they didn't stop, they didn't give up until they found everyone, including Arthur, who was discovered with 2 unconscious boys, about 45 minutes away from the nearest group. By 11 p.m., the rescue mission was complete. But that victory was only partial, for upon hearing about the boys' critical condition, local doctors faced another grueling challenge. They had to find a way to reach the mountain in unimaginable conditions. One doctor abandoned his ambulance, mounted a horse, and walked 3 kilometers through chest-deep snow to get to where he was needed. It was a journey not only of resilience, but also of the faint hope of saving lives. When the doctors arrived, the scene was truly a nightmare. 2 boys had already died before the doctors could do anything. But despite this, the villagers, refusing to give up, tried to keep the bodies warm, hoping they could bring the boys back from the brink of death. But harsh reality hit hard. Despite their best efforts, 2 more boys passed away just before dawn. By morning, the 2 most critical cases had been taken to the hospital in Freiburg, but only 1 survived. In total, 5 boys aged between 12 and 14 lost their lives, leaving behind unanswered questions and a pain that would never fade. What happened that night became one of the most heartbreaking memories I have ever read about. I don't need to recount the details of the agony those boys endured in their shorts and sandals under the sub-zero cold. It was as tragic as you can imagine, if not worse. A doctor later told me in a voice full of helplessness, "We did everything we could to save them, but the hardships the boys endured were beyond imagination. Total exhaustion was inevitable." But the story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The next day, Saturday, April 18th, Arthur, the teacher who had led the boys, suddenly became the focal point of a media storm. Press editors from across Europe swarmed, pushing him into a defensive position. And it was at that moment that the lies began to emerge. At first, they were vague explanations, distorted truths. But when pressed for more details, Arthur, perhaps out of fear, fabricated an entirely different story, painting himself as a hero who had not only survived the tragedy, but had bravely stayed behind with the fallen boys, organizing a calculated and thoughtful rescue mission. He even claimed that the group couldn't make it down the mountain, despite having 7-foot-long skis with them, and major newspapers like The Observer, The Times, and The Guardian quickly published the story without verification. But the locals, those who actually knew the truth, couldn't believe what they were reading. A witness later recounted, "When I read the paper, I immediately knew it wasn't the truth." But the truth was concealed, and Arthur wasn't the only one with a vested interest in this. Shortly after the tragedy, the Nazis saw the political potential of the event. An elaborate propaganda campaign was orchestrated, with British flags and swastikas draped over the coffins of the boys, creating a symbolic spectacle, a message broadcast across Europe. The memorial service on Sunday was attended by the British Consul General and members of the Nazi Party. A grand performance was staged, but the truth remained buried beneath the thick snow, never fully revealed. Listen carefully to how the German newspaper Der Allgemeine described the memorial service that day. A ceremony that seemed to honor the unfortunate boys, but was saturated with political undertones and manipulation. In the name of the Hitler Youth, the regional leader spoke about the desire for mutual understanding and peace, which he claimed was the strongest ideal among the youth. His words deeply resonated with the hearts of the attendees as they raised their hands in the German salute, honoring their fallen British comrades. The story didn't end with a simple memorial service. Behind the flowery words and solemn rituals lay a deeper political scheme, masked under the guise of compassion and solidarity. The surviving British boys, those who narrowly escaped death, were not allowed to say goodbye to their friends on that Sunday afternoon. Instead of being given the chance to grieve and bid farewell to their lost friends, they were drawn into a carefully calculated game. Just hours after learning about the deaths of their companions, they were taken to play a public football match with the local Hitler Youth. What seemed like an act of kindness, an attempt to distract them from their trauma, was in reality a perfect PR maneuver. But let's pause for a moment. Why was this tragedy so significant to Germany, and why did the German government want to exploit it? These questions are difficult to answer without considering the historical context. If you know what was happening in Germany in 1936, you might already have some clarity. But if not, let me give you some perspective. You see, in 1936, Hitler had been in power for 3 years, and relations between Britain and Germany were growing increasingly tense. Across Britain and other parts of Europe, there was mounting concern over Hitler's aggressive actions. However, at the time, no country was willing to risk war, and they hoped that appeasement might maintain peace. This policy, later known as the policy of appeasement, was essentially a way of tolerating Nazi Germany's aggressive behavior, much like how one might pacify a wild animal to avoid being attacked. From a foreign policy perspective, Britain had become one of the most important nations supporting Hitler's Germany because they wanted to maintain peace. Just days before this tragedy, Britain had held a grand funeral for the German ambassador to Britain, a man seen as a symbol of hope for preserving peaceful relations between the two nations. The British government had spared no effort in organizing the funeral, returning the ambassador's body to Germany aboard the warship HMS Scout with the swastika flag flown at half-mast. It was the first time a British warship had entered a German port since the end of World War I, a significant event. So what does this have to do with the deaths of 5 boys on that snowy mountain? The simple answer is everything. Germany didn't want to damage this crucial relationship by accusing British citizens of manslaughter. Making any charges would create a major PR crisis, potentially derailing fragile diplomatic efforts. Instead of focusing on seeking justice for this tragedy, the main question Germany faced was, how can we use this tragedy to the greatest advantage for Nazi Germany? Amid this tense political landscape, the truth of what happened on the mountain was sidelined. On the morning of Tuesday, April 21st at 8:30 a.m., the bodies of the unfortunate boys were returned to Britain. Each coffin was adorned with both the British flag and the Nazi swastika, and a wreath bore the words, "To our British comrades, from Hitler himself." Along the journey, at each train station, the Hitler Youth stood guard, like soldiers of honor. This spectacle wasn't just a funeral, it quickly turned into a major media event across Europe, with hundreds of reports from Reuters' European Bureau. Meanwhile, on April 20th, Arthur, the teacher who had led the boys on their fateful journey, was being questioned by Chief Public Prosecutor Eugen Weiss. During the interrogation, Arthur gave a brief and shallow statement. "I did not foresee the snowstorm. Everything happened completely unexpectedly." But what stood out wasn't just what Arthur said, but what he didn't say. He didn't mention his encounters with the local postman, the warnings from the Trenkel family, or the advice he had ignored from the snow shovelers before the journey began. These critical details were overlooked by Arthur, which led to Weiss not having enough grounds to prosecute him. As a result, the case was dismissed, and Arthur returned as a hero who had escaped the jaws of death. But the story didn't end there. On Friday, April 24th, nearly a week after the tragedy, a series of new witness statements were sent to Weiss's office. These testimonies, from hostile staff, the Trenkel family, the postman, and others, painted an entirely different picture. After listening to and comparing all the accounts, Weiss realized he had made a terrible mistake. Arthur was not the victim of a sudden snowstorm. He was the cause of the tragedy. He had ignored all the warnings, led the boys blindly with misplaced confidence, and brought them to their deaths. By the end of April, Weiss had written a 25-page report, harshly criticizing Arthur. He analyzed every detail of the incident, and every wrong decision made by Arthur was carefully documented. The report was so meticulously organized and scientific that it led to one clear conclusion: Arthur was a liar and needed to be investigated for manslaughter. And that is precisely what Eugen Weiss proposed to the Reich Ministry of Justice in Berlin. Weiss was not the only one suspicious of Arthur's story. Jack Eaton, the father of one of the boys who had died, also began noticing inconsistencies. He couldn't accept that this tragedy was simply an accident. Grieving and furious over the loss of his beloved son, Eaton was determined to uncover the truth for himself. He made several trips to Freiburg, retracing the path that Arthur and the boys had taken, and spoke to local residents. What he discovered not only astonished him, but also ignited a fierce anger. Eaton knew he had to do whatever it took to reveal the terrible truth that had been hidden. Back in London, Jack Eaton didn't give up. Under the supervision of the London County Council, a subcommittee was formed to investigate the Black Forest accident. The inquiry took place on May 15th and 16th, with Arthur present. However, the primary purpose of the investigation was not to determine whether Arthur had been criminally negligent, but rather to see if the parents were satisfied with the arrangements for the trip. The subcommittee completely overlooked the crucial details that Eaton had uncovered. After 8 hours of meetings, the final conclusion was, Arthur had done everything he could, and he had acted with courage and bravery. Eaton, however, refused to let it rest. He spoke out forcefully from beginning to end, unafraid to criticize both Arthur and the older boys, whom he believed had abandoned the group when night fell instead of seeking help. Eaton's declaration was filled with outrage. "I curse you, and I curse you 1,000 times over, and those cowards you are protecting." But how did Arthur escape accountability? Hadn't the parents and the committee seen Weiss's report, the one from the German public prosecutor? The 25-page report, full of witness statements, should have been sent to the British consulate in Frankfurt, which led the investigation. Yet somehow, that report never arrived. In the official documents of the subcommittee, the report seemed to have never existed. It was not mentioned, not even once. Meanwhile, in Germany, the propaganda campaign continued. The story was constantly revised and shaped to serve the government's interests. Now the narrative spread that the Hitler Youth had assisted the villagers in rescuing the boys on that fateful night. On June 8, 1936, less than 2 months after the tragedy, Weiss received a silent and unexplained order to suspend the investigation into Arthur. Weiss knew that the detailed report he had written had never reached the investigation, but he couldn't accept that the truth would be buried. On June 12th, he took a bold step. He handed the full report to the editor of the Daily Express in Berlin. He hoped that once the truth was made public, it would create a shockwave that would bring everything to light. But what happened next? Absolutely nothing. The truth never came out. In the following months, Jack Eaton didn't give up. He did everything he could to seek justice. He distributed flyers, printed posters with the information and evidence he had gathered. He did whatever he could to keep the story from being forgotten. But all of his efforts seemed to be extinguished by an invisible wall of silence and indifference. When Arthur attempted to organize another school trip, this time intended to go through German territory, Eaton tried to stop it. He pleaded with anyone who would listen, including Weiss, to continue the investigation and hold Arthur accountable. But the powers at play didn't want that to happen. The British Foreign Office even prohibited Arthur from participating in any future trips abroad. If Arthur didn't enter Germany, he couldn't be prosecuted, even if the Germans wanted to. Historical records clearly show that even Germany did not want to prosecute Arthur. In a letter from the German Ministry of Justice to Weiss, they admitted, "Technically, we should prosecute Arthur if he sets foot on German soil, but we will not do so due to procedural difficulties." The truth was pushed into a dark corner, and no one wanted to face it. In the end, even Weiss had to let go. In a letter filled with frustration addressed to his superiors, he wrote, "Public opinion, due to a lack of understanding of the events, does not hold Arthur responsible for the deaths of the boys." Even the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who had read Weiss's entire report, wanted the matter to disappear. No action was taken. Justice remained out of reach for the families who had suffered such terrible loss. Jack Eaton didn't give up. He followed Arthur relentlessly, harassing him whenever he could. One particularly heartbreaking event occurred on June 16, 1937, which would have been Eaton's son's 16th birthday. Eaton was arrested while trying to place a wreath in front of Arthur's house, shouting, "My son was murdered." I wish this story could end with justice. I wish that Weiss and Eaton had finally uncovered the truth they were searching for. But this isn't a movie, and life doesn't always end with a happy conclusion. Time passed, and the tragedy faded into obscurity. Apart from disputes over who had the right to write what on the memorial plaques, no one spoke about the tragedy anymore. By September 1939, another war had begun, and the forces that had shaped the story on the mountain were once again occupied with other schemes. Even after the war, the pain endured by the families of the boys made them unwilling to reopen the past. All hope for justice disappeared. Jack Alexander, another father who lost his son, died in a mental hospital. His marriage fell apart, and the fight for justice destroyed him completely. A year after the tragedy, even the right to inscribe the truth on his son's memorial stone at the place where the boy had died was taken away. The final line on the memorial should have read, "Their teacher did not save them in their hour of need." But now there was a blank space where those words had once been engraved. Arthur continued his teaching career, although over time, more damning truths about him began to surface. Horrifying allegations of abuse eventually came to light, but that is another story. As time passed, memories of the tragedy faded, as they often do. Outside of the local area, few people remembered the Inlander Unglück, the English misfortune. Schools sometimes organized trips to the stone memorial that still stood on the slopes of Schaansland, but very few people knew the real story of what had happened that day. As Weiss had once said, without knowing the truth, most people only remember the story of an unavoidable tragedy. But lies, especially those woven from the concealment of truth, eventually unravel. And the truth was revealed in the most unexpected way. We owe this revelation to a retired local teacher named Bernd Hyman. As a longtime resident of Freiburg, Hyman had always felt that the story the locals knew about the tragedy didn't quite add up. Out of curiosity, Hyman began his own investigation. Nothing could have prepared him for the horrifying truth he would uncover. Decades later, in a dusty library in Freiburg, Bernd Hyman had a strange hunch about the incident. He couldn't understand why the story had always haunted his mind. Driven by curiosity, Bernd began researching what really happened on that mountain. He sifted through old documents, faded reports that had been nearly forgotten. What he found sent chills down his spine. Hidden within the yellowed papers was a detailed report by prosecutor Eugen Weiss, a 25-page document that could have changed everything. This report exposed every deadly mistake Arthur had made, from his lack of preparation, failure to check the weather, to his arrogance in ignoring the villagers' warnings. Each page told a story that had never been spoken aloud. Not an accident, but negligence and irresponsibility had killed those children. Bernd didn't stop there. He continued his investigation, uncovering more details, connecting the dots. He reached out to the surviving relatives of the victims, listened to their stories, and gradually pieced together the full picture. The deeper Bernd dug, the more he realized that the deaths of the 5 boys were not a random event. They were the result of a series of reckless decisions, a chain of irresponsible actions, and the unforgivable arrogance of a teacher. This discovery felt like lifting a massive iceberg buried deep beneath icy waters. The questions that had long gone unasked now resurfaced. How would the families of the boys feel if they knew the truth? Would their pain be eased in knowing that their children's deaths weren't the result of cruel fate, but the fault of someone they had once trusted? And most importantly, could justice ever be served after all these years? As the truth slowly emerged, a sense of sorrow filled the air. The years had passed, and many of those involved were no longer alive to face responsibility. Jack Eaton, the father who had tirelessly fought for his son, had died alone in a mental hospital, never witnessing the truth he had once tried to uncover. But Burns' story rekindled a flame of truth that, though long buried, would eventually surface. The tragic accident wasn't just the story of boys lost in the snow. It was a story of betrayal, guilty silence, and the relentless struggle of those seeking justice. Once again, history reminds us that no matter how many secrets time tries to bury, the truth, like a beam of light, always finds a way to shine through.